You have no murder weapon. You have nothing. And all these stories we've been telling each other, just that. Stories.
Welcome back to IndieCade, the celebration of innovation and independent games. I'm Erika Ishii, and I would like to remind everybody that you can enter the giveaway that we are doing by going to twitch.skybound.com and registering there. I'm here with the developer of what I believe to be the most innovative game of this year, Her Story. I'm actually serious about this. Don't be humble about it. Would you like to introduce yourself, sir?
Yeah, I'm Sam Barlow. I developed Her Story. It's my first independent game after 10 plus years making bigger games for the publishers, and this was me branching out to make something a bit more personal, a bit more experimental.
Excellent. And the gentleman over here who is going to help me with the interview.
Hi, I'm Todd. I write about games for the LA. Take one over there.
Excellent. And you're going to be our guinea pig.
Yeah. And I am so excited to play this. I have been obsessed with crime narratives since I was a little kid.
You actually said narratives there.
Yes. No, I mean, it didn't matter. I read Nancy Drew, I read The Hardy Boys, I read the early versions.
Wait, Nancy Drew too?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God.
Anytime someone was solving a crime, I needed to read it or watch it. So this game really excited me when I first heard about it.
So would you like to tell us a little bit about the game?
Yeah, so the game is very simple. When you play the game, you're essentially sat in front of a 90s desktop computer in a police station somewhere. And this computer lets you access a database full of hundreds of clips of video footage of this one woman being interviewed about a missing husband. And so you search through the database and kind of uncover in this interesting long way what's going on, what's the story, what kind of layers behind it.
How did you write this? I mean, was there a process? Because as you'll see, it's a very specific process between the design of the game and actually getting the pieces of the narrative.
Yeah, so the way the game works is, it's very simple. I can't explain it. It's like Googling a narrative. So you type in search words, and then the database will return all the clips in which the woman uses those words when she's answering the questions. So if you learn the name of a character, you'll get the clips where she talks about that character. So kind of as you learn clues, you can dig deeper into the narrative. But you can also free associate and search for love, hate, kind of make leaps of logic. And so it's this kind of really interesting way in which kind of the use of words, the subtext in the dialogue becomes part of the kind of gameplay.
No luck with Cupcake, huh?
No luck with Cupcake.
It was a valiant effort. Did you watch the videos for murder?
I didn't. It was very interesting that murder is it's automatically put in there for you. I didn't watch it.
You gotta start somewhere. I feel like an investigation of a murder would some murder would pop up.
That's
videos,
true. All right, let's watch the first video for murder.
You think it's murder? Clearly it's murder. What can I do to help?
So this actress that you worked with, Viva Seifert, how did you guys meet?
So that's like a cool part of the whole story of the jump from AAA to indie is that I worked with Viva on this kind of big action adventure game I was making for about 3 years before it's cancelled.
Are you allowed to say what it is?
I don't know if I can. People can probably Google and find out.
Right.
So, we had this publisher pay for a really extensive casting session, got to meet loads of great actors, and Viva was one of them that we met, and we cast on that project. So I worked with her for about a year on that project. We had a really good relationship working together, and she's just a tremendous performer. We can throw a line at her, and she will just kind of draw all the subtext out and do things with her face and her voice, and she's just so kind of watchable. So when I started working on this project, and kind of realized, well, this is going to be this game where you sit and watch a woman sat in a room talking. It was like Viva was kind of the first thing that came to mind. So I kind of reached out to her, and she agreed to it before she realized quite what was involved. And at some point she rang me up and she was like, so hang on a minute, I'm the only character in this and everything is on me. Yeah.
How many pages did she have to memorize? Because it's her essentially doing this giant monologue from beginning to end, and just her.
So the first script I sent her had 300 pages because it was formatted to kind of fit with the game.
What did you just say?
So she went,
300. He was gonna make a girl memorize 300 pages.
So what I did was I then changed the font size, tweaked it around, and it was 150 pages. So that was like easier. So the going in high kind of helped. But yeah, I mean, it was like we shot the whole thing in a week, continuously, kind of essentially chronologically. So the experience for us was kind of similar to the experience of the character in the game, in that we were just sat in this room. I was playing the role of the detectives. So a feature of the game is that although the character is being interrogated by the police, you never hear the questions that they're asking. You only ever hear her answers, which allows you to kind of infer the context of what's going on, try and figure out what the questions are being asked. But we actually scripted all of the detectives' questions. So the whole thing kind of flowed, and I would read the detectives' questions off camera, and then so we just kind of ran this whole thing through as this very intense experience. So by the end of it, Viva was genuinely exhausted, which kind of helped with the performance.
The interrogation feeling.
So one of the things I find super interesting, like automatically, we went with murder, and in my head, murder weapon only brings up one video, which is super interesting to me. But then body, right? Like there has to be a body, and then there's this video of her playing a guitar.
This is one of the most contentious parts. Some people love this, and some people are like, "What is going on with the guitar?"
Yeah, why is she playing a guitar if she's being interrogated
it all makes
about?
Sense. It all makes sense. If you play the game, it all makes sense.
Now, you intentionally left out all of the police questions, correct? Why did you do that?
It was something that kind of came out of the process. So the way I developed this game was kind of different to how we develop most games, in that I spent at least half of the dev time up front on paper, not touching a computer, just doing lots of research, reading up on all the police manuals, how you do these things, how the psychology works. Reading up on a ton of cases, watching lots of footage of people being interviewed. And kind of during that process, when I started the game, I was kind of thinking in my head, this is a game about being a detective. It's about finding the truth, and that's your role as being a detective. But as I watched more and more footage of these kind of real-life interviews, and kind of felt bad about it, because these police interviews, it's like these really intense, personal, intimate discussions. You have people that have done terrible things, and this is the first time they've ever got to speak about them, and you have the homicide detective who's going, "Hey, I'm your best friend, just talk to me about this." And now the police put these things up on YouTube, and they're on the news, and you can watch them, and it's that kind of the guilt I felt enjoying this stuff and watching this stuff really kind of, I started to empathize with the people being interviewed, and particularly here when we're listening to her story with the woman in the chair. So I was thinking about ways to kind of reframe it so the power was given back to her and her story, and so kind of removing the detective was one way of kind of reframing this narrative so that it was her story she was putting out there. And it gives the player a nice role in that you are not the detective necessarily, but at points you feel like that, so there's this kind of balance of you being able to slip into that.
A little more immersive.
It feels like you're kind of at points in the room with her, and there's a kind of dialogue going on. You're typing things, you're listening to what she's saying, you get this kind of intimate connection.
It does feel very personal. Yeah, I'm very curious because you called this one of the most innovative games of the year.
Yeah.
And Todd writes about more games, I think, than I've ever played, and so I'm curious to hear what your perspective is on this being the most.
I got to do it in front of.
You have to, you have to do it in front of them.
No, I wrote about the game. It's one of my favorite games of the year, and one of the things that stuck out to me is that there are sort of two mysteries in the game. There's the mystery of what this character did or didn't do. There's also the mystery of why you yourself, the player, are trying to uncover that, and you sort of start to. As the game goes on, you learn very, very little bits and pieces about why you may be sort of after this information. And I just wanted to get a thought from you on sort of like that approach, because you keep the player in the dark on who exactly the player is until the very end of the game. And it's sort of, most games have that narrative drive right from the start. So you can just talk about that decision. And
yeah, I mean, something that fascinates me is trying to figure out how that works. You've got the player sat on the sofa at home, you've got the actual protagonist of the story in a game, you've got other characters, and where you're sitting with that, and how that fits in a continuum with movies and stuff, right? The role of the audience in movies and how they empathize with characters and stuff is very interesting and fluid. And I think video games, sometimes we make the assumption that it's a lot simpler in video games. You are the character on screen, and we do everything we can to make you feel like that character. So like when I was a kid, I grew up on like all Looking Glass games, these immersive first-person games where the idea is it's like virtual reality. You are embodying that character. But as I kind of dug deeper into storytelling and tried to figure out what interested me about storytelling, I was much more interested in the way that most stories require this little bit of distance and this kind of frame around the narrative. So in this game, there's, on one hand, it's super immersive in that your computer, as you play it, is the computer in the story, so this direct connection, and it's this kind of very intimate mechanic of searching through words. But then it isn't your computer because it's this kind of 90s computer with the glare and the kind of reflections in the CRT, and that creates this little bit of distance and this little bit of your brain thinking, like say, it's not the primary focus as you're playing, but you're kind of asking questions of who you are, and that kind of makes you think a bit more and frame things. And I think that kind of combination of deeply being immersed, deeply feeling something, whilst also having this kind of slightly kind of cerebral layer which has you thinking alongside it, I think that's a really kind of important part of storytelling, and that's something I wanted to explore here. And there's part of that, this ties us directly back to proper video games. When I originally played the game Metroid Prime, there's a feature in that game where you are playing as Samus Aran and you're seeing through her eyes, through her visor, and she never talks, so it's the kind of game where it feels very much like she is you and you're very deeply embodied. And then in the most intense points of the game, there'll be explosions going off, and you see her eyes reflected in her visor. And it's this moment when that first happened to me where it's pushing you out of being this person because you're like, those aren't my eyes, but at the same time, it kind of redoubles your kind of immersion in it. There's like, I'm a huge fan of Hitchcock, and Hitchcock does this thing where he will throw in comedy or some really strong visual thing, which is in some ways pushing the audience away from the movie, kind of making them question whether it's real or not. And I find that the way that works is, as a member of the audience, if you are immersed in something and the work pushes you a little bit, you tend to kind of push back and double down on your immersion. So all these kind of techniques are things that have always fascinated me. That's a big part of how this works.
Why live action? I know you've had experience with mocap before. Why not just make it like a normal video game?
I think I was definitely, like the last few years of working on this big project, we spent a lot of time and money on this kind of high-end performance capture. And working with performers like Viva, there was always like a perverse, it felt slightly perverse and kind of wasteful that we'd review the stuff in game and you'd have the video footage from the mocap set, and the characters would be in their leotards and it'd be on a kind of crappy handheld video camera, but you'd kind of look at a scene and you'd say, that bit of performance there is beautiful. The expression, the way these characters exchange a look is really moving. And then you'd cut over to the CGI version and it wouldn't quite be there, and you'd have to spend another 3 weeks of having a ton of animators tweak the characters. So there was always a slight frustration I had with like how hard it is to get something as straightforward as a low-budget indie movie can just grab a camera, point it at someone, and you can get that performance on screen. And when I started doing this, there was like a fear I had of kind of jumping into the indie thing was I loved working with performers, I loved writing performers. And I knew that I wasn't going to have like $2 million mocap budget for this indie game. And when I was originally researching the game, I didn't really know what it was going to be. I knew it was about police interviews. I knew it was probably going to revolve around some kind of dialogue in this room. And as I was watching all this kind of YouTube footage of real-life interrogations, that's when it kind of popped into my head. Hey, I could just use real video and I could make it look authentic, and then I get to not only still work with performers, but actually the piece revolves around the performance. And is really exciting.
I feel like even if you had that $2 million budget for mocap, it's not quite there yet. I mean, we saw it in LA Noire where they're like, oh, it's going to center around the tics of actors, you're going to be able to figure things out in interrogation due to acting, but it's still a little uncanny, and you can't get like a quirky looks, and live action was the perfect medium for this.
I mean, the hair physics, the skin shading is perfect.
Dead on, right?
I'm super fascinated so far at having watched a sort of like a series of 10-second videos, and in those 10 seconds, I now have more questions than I started with. I mean, she failed. The only thing she failed her lie detector test on is her name, and that's super fascinating. But then lie doesn't lead you to anything kind of more interesting, but her name leads you to more interesting things. And then there's a whole series of names of guys that I still don't know who they are, and
you need a notepad. Everyone needs to play this game with a notepad.
I like this little feature here, so you can at least go back to things.
And then if you
so that you can go back to these.
My favorite, the most useful
There's
thing
a
for me
secret.
was constantly checking the database checker to see how many volumes that I got.
So that gives you a sense of how much is out there.
So the green is what I've watched, and the red is what. Oh, I have a lot to go.
This is like, I'm a big fan of iceberg theory, which is kind of how Hemingway explained how he writes, which is you have all the story, and the thinking behind the story is the iceberg, but what the audience sees is this tiny tip, and then their imagination fills in the rest. And this is kind of like, the thing that's beautiful about video games is you can have all this content and it's off screen. Like if this was a book, you would see how many pages there were and you could flick through all the pages. If this was a movie, you could just it's going to be 2 hours, I'm going to sit here, I'll see all the content if I just keep my eyes on the screen. With a video game, it's just there lurking somewhere off screen. That's kind of fun.
Well, I was curious because you mentioned like the lie detector test, and like you mentioned all the research you did on cases. Was there at any point during the development of the game where you sort of thought, there would be like case files you could sort of investigate, or you could go back and read the lie detector like results?
Yeah, that was at various points during development. I was feeling like I should do that, and I had tons of kind of material that was there that I could have used for that to create this kind of more mixed media thing. And every time I almost did it, I stopped myself because I was like, this is my old school game designer brain kicking in, going, there should be loads of things and loads of content and stuff. Whereas the reason I fell in love with this idea was this very simple mechanic of typing words and the richness of the words and the language and watching the clips and listening to her talk and looking at what's going on the screen. It was like the more stuff that happens around that's going to diminish the kind of the impact and the purity of that. So, like there are things you can do, and as I think we saw with Michael earlier, there's like a little mini game and stuff in there, but it's kind of boring enough that you can, like, when you first start playing this, you can fiddle around and push the screen around just so it kind of feels authentic and interactive, but it's uninteresting enough that then you're going to just go back to the core mechanic and focus on that, and that's where your experience happens.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us. This is really just one of the most creative and interesting games, and one of the best narratives that I've played this year. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks for playing.
Yeah, I have so much more to learn about this woman. I'm really fascinated.
Hey guys, thanks so much for joining us for our IndieCade experience. We had such an awesome time, so why don't you keep joining us by subscribing below and talk to us in the comments, because that's super fun. Also, we're going to keep uploading conversations that we had with game developers at IndieCade, so stay tuned, stick around, because we've got more of that good stuff coming. Yeah.